Hello, YouTube, and welcome to CrossLine, the show where I interview YouTubers about their faith. I'm Benedict the 17th, and with me tonight is YouTuber and friend of the show, Reality Weasel. Reality's been making YouTube videos for the past 2 years. He's an advocate for classical liberalism, and his videos deal with history, philosophy, and biology. Reality, glad to have you back.
Glad to be here, Benedict. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure. So let's get right into it. You're a Jewish atheist. Were you raised in a Jewish family?
I was. So my father is Jewish. His parents were Jewish. Certainly of a far more conservative bent than he was. My mother is not Jewish. She was raised Catholic, but she kind of rejected her faith later in life and never had any stake in my religious upbringing. So it was more or less my father and his side of the family who had the most influence on that part of my life.
Okay. Did you go to synagogue as a child, or?
I did. My father took. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Yeah. What were some of the practices that you grew up with?
Oh, sure. All right. Yes, my father did take me to synagogue as a child. My whole family went, so my father and my mother. We went to synagogue usually for high holy days and occasionally to observe the Sabbath. But we observed the fasts. I didn't at a younger age. That I started doing that maybe at 12 or 13. But we celebrated all the major holidays. We celebrated Passover. We celebrated Hanukkah, which is not really a major holiday, but it's kind of a big deal in America for Jewish people. We celebrate Sukkot and a lot of stuff. Kind of the genuine, kind of like the standard practice for Reform Jews, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you mentioned you celebrated Sukkot.
Yeah.
While Hanukkah might be familiar to some of the audience, what's Sukkot?
Sukkot is it literally means booths. Booths which you construct in your backyard or whatever. But you basically construct a very large canopy, I guess is the best way to describe it. It's a large canopy that traditionally you're supposed to sleep under. Not everybody does, but you're supposed to do many things under it. Eat, sleep, pray. But it's in commemoration of when the Hebrew people were exiled in the desert and they had to build booths to survive. That's what they used for shelter. So 1 week out of the year we commemorate that.
Cool. And you mentioned you were a Reform Jew.
That's right.
So Reform Judaism is kind of one of the big three branches. Like there's Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox.
Mm-hmm.
What does the distinction of those three mean to you?
Okay, sure. I think it's best to understand this historically because it's kind of the distinctions might seem kind of arbitrary without historical context. So when I hear conservative Judaism, I think kind of mainstream traditional Judaism, and this is the Judaism that was practiced, I guess, pre-19th century in Ashkenaz or Eastern Europe. In the shtetl, the Jewish villages, before things like the Russian Revolution, before many of the events of before the Pale of Settlement. So this is kind of what everybody was doing in general, and it's the practice of conservative Judaism holds that the Torah and the Talmud and all of the important sacred texts are to be taken seriously. We are to derive our laws from them, but we can also bring in examples of history and some theological debate if necessary, if we have some kind of confusion or some ambiguity in determining what the proper jurisprudence is on a given matter of faith or even just daily life. And that kind of that integration of history and philosophy becomes especially important in conservative Judaism during a period called the Haskalah, which is described as the Jewish Enlightenment, where a lot of Jews in the shtetl were getting kind of fed up with life there, and so they wanted to integrate into mainstream Western Europe, and so they said, okay, so how can we reconcile some of the more conservative aspects of Judaism with a modernizing liberal Europe, so that we can be considered part of this mainstream society.
And when you say the shtetl, does that refer to kind of the Jewish quarters in European cities, or?
Yeah, well, the shtetl, as kind of an umbrella term, it really refers to Eastern Europe, which was not as developed as Western Europe, but it had that was kind of the European homeland of the Jews, if you will. Generally not as developed as Western Europe, not great living conditions, very crowded, very lots of children, so kind of overpopulated.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Where was I?
You were talking about how at some point the Jews wanted to integrate with European society,
right.
and
Yes. So they wanted to integrate with mainstream European society, and that's where Orthodox Judaism comes in, because Orthodox Judaism as a movement and as a practice was actually it was a reaction to a lot of what we would call conservative Jews, but what they perceived themselves as just regular traditional Jews. It was a reaction to those people wanting to integrate, because by integrating and incorporating history and philosophy into the Jewish practice, the Orthodox Jews felt that the conservatives, or the traditional Jews, had, in a sense, betrayed the Jewish faith, that they had committed some very heinous violations of Jewish law. And so, as we know it today, the Orthodox movement is all about, the halachic laws, the Jewish laws and the sacred texts are binding in basically every single case. It's usually not a matter of historical criticism or philosophical debate. It is extremely traditionalist. It is extremely literalist in some senses. It is really the most conservative form of Judaism that one can imagine. And there are even sub-branches of Orthodox Judaism, like Haredism, for example, which they're basically recluses, and they kind of live in separate enclaves away from the rest of society. They're very, it's about it's about the preservation of the Jewish faith, I would say the main kind of mission statement is. And then, several centuries later, that's where my practice enters in, where you have the Reform Jews, which in some circles can also be called liberal Judaism or progressive Judaism. And this is kind of a post-civil rights, post-sexual revolution version of Judaism, where people said, okay, how can we reconcile traditional Judaism with an increasingly egalitarian society?
and about what time period was this?
This is like 1970s.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, for example, one of the big kind of a big tradition in conservative Judaism is the gender partition. So you can't, during services, you can't have the men and women sitting next to each other. There's usually some kind of physical separation or barrier between the two sexes. And usually when the men are studying or praying or what have you, the women will often be in a different room in say a conservative temple. Reform Judaism does away with all of that. They said, no, men and women should be able to pray together. We should be more accepting of all people who want to practice the faith. So that includes homosexuals, which is kind of a no-no in conservative Judaism and big time in Orthodox Judaism. We should be open to anyone and everyone who wants to identify as a Jew or practice as a Jew. It's very, very inclusive and kind of, I guess, what we would call progressive in the 21st century.
Okay. Um, Now, apart from being a Jew, you're also an atheist.
Yes.
What was there a time in your life that you kind of identified with that label, or did you kind of just grow up not really believing in God?
Well, I can't really say there was a time when I believed in God because the Reform practice doesn't place as much emphasis on the reality of God or the existence of God, I guess. It's not a big talking point. A lot of Reform Jews will, they'll hold that as you practice the mitzvot, the commandments, as long as you hold to the Jewish tradition and the Jewish values, then you're as good a Jew as any, and God doesn't necessarily have to be in that picture. So that was basically how I was raised, and I can't really say I ever believed in God as a child, but I didn't really fall into the label of atheist until later in my life as a teenager, which is when I discovered this new atheist movement of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, which as a teenager appealed to me very, very much. And so I started becoming more comfortable adopting the label of atheist, but it certainly wasn't a large part of my identity for most of my life.
Okay. Yeah, I know in the intro to your channel, you specifically mentioned Sam Harris. Was there something particular about, his arguments or the way he addressed the question of religious belief in God that you found particularly appealing?
Yeah, certainly. So I think what attracted me to Harris the most was the lucidity with which he argued. He basically said, "Look, uh, you know, no God, to the best of our knowledge, has ever presented himself to us in any verifiable way on a material level or on an empirical level. So therefore, why would we assume that he exists?" And even as a teenager, I had a big interest in science and empirical philosophy. That was what I was planning to pursue in college, and so I spent a lot of my time in high school kind of training myself to think in that way. And so I think that was really why I was attracted to Harris and Christopher Hitchens as well.
Hmm.
um yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah, do you so kind of navigating these two identities, which Jewish and atheist, but as a practicing Jew,
Hmm.
do you find there's tension there? Like when you celebrate different feasts today, do you find it difficult to do so? Well, what is that experience like? Because a lot of these feasts have prayers and
Hmm.
services that are directed towards a god.
Right. That's a very good question, because I've actually been kind of contemplating a lot about that lately. Because okay, well, let's just say that let's start off by saying that I never really felt any tension between being a Jew and being an atheist. Like I said, the Reform practice holds that as long as you're adhering to the Jewish values, then or you're integrated in the Jewish tradition, then you're as good a Jew as any. And there are actually a lot of conservative rabbis and scholars who also believe this. Their arguments are far more nuanced than my own or what I was raised on, but no, that there's a big, it's kind of common thought in Jewish communities that you can be a Jewish atheist with no compunctions in your Judaism. So for example, when I pray, which I do every Friday at synagogue and during feasts and holidays and what have you, when I pray, I view it more as kind of upholding a tradition, or as celebrating my heritage or my people, or uh, the very, what am I trying to say here? the things that my ancestors did and have carried on into my own life. I have a great deal of reverence for that. So that's mostly what I feel when I pray.
So,
Where's sorry, go on.
so even if I mean, even if you know, your ancestors, the Jewish people of old, might have written these prayers and prayed these prayers to a god and for a god.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you found a way to be able to say that these things are still good and still part of our heritage, even if God doesn't exist.
Right, absolutely, because there is, there's a very rich Jewish heritage that doesn't involve God. It's a or religion, even. It's a culture of food and literature and artistic expression and kind of ways of thinking about the world in general. I mean, there is a lot to Judaism. I don't like to think of Jewish or Jews as an ethnicity per se, but there's a lot of scholars who argue that they are, because they make up this kind of distinct cultural group that isn't necessarily doesn't have all the trappings of a mainstream Western society or a secular society. It is its own little demographic subgroup,
Yeah,
and there's a lot of things I like to celebrate about that, because I find a lot of them really joyful and enriching.
yeah, there is kind of this tension in Judaism which doesn't exist, or doesn't exist to the same extent in other religions, where it's part ethnicity, part culture,
Right.
part religion.
Uh-huh. And
Um, oh, go ahead.
yeah, and well, I was going to say that there's people who are not practicing but still like to identify as Jewish, because they celebrate those same traditions, and they might not observe as many holidays as I do, or as a conservative Jew might. But they certainly feel some connection to their ancestors or to their heritage, and they celebrate that in just kind of a casual way, and like to identify as Jewish all the same.
Would you say this is kind of a modern development in Judaism? You mentioned the reform practice started in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
But is this consideration of Judaism something that goes back farther than that, or did it come in with the reform practice? Or
I honestly can't say. It seems to be. I will say this. It seems to be a very American phenomenon, because I lived in London for a little bit, and most of the Jews I encountered there, even at my own temple, were very, very conservative. There seems to be less of a concept of, say, like a civic religion in England, or in London at the very least. So in America we have this concept of a civic religion, where you're a citizen first, or an American first, or a participant in a liberal system first, and then whatever other religious identities you possess, you kind of tack on after that. There's not really that separation in London, at least in my experience, where most of the Jews were Jews first and Londoners second, or Britons second. So this phenomenon of cultural Judaism, where you can kind of divorce the faith from all of the other nice cultural things, seems to be a very American thing, where faith is not necessarily the top priority in your Jewish identity.
yeah, there is this kind of American tradition, not so much of religious tolerance, but I'd say almost a kind of religious pluralism. Like you talked about kind of the kind of patriotic identity, patriotic religion, and I see that too in in my own faith community. Like there is an American flavor to religion here. Um,
Hold on, sorry. I think you just cut out.
oh, sorry. Can you hear
Just
me?
for like those last few seconds. Are you? Am I coming through all right?
Yeah, you're coming through.
Okay.
Yeah,
Could you repeat what you? Yeah.
yeah. I just said that. I noticed that same tension or tension in my own faith community. That
Mm-hmm.
in America there is almost a religious pluralism where people identify. Well, there's kind of an American flavor to one's
Right.
religion.
Uh-huh.
Um, do you think that maybe that's more true of, say, Reform Judaism versus conservative or Orthodox in the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is this, what I've noticed, and this is where I think I'm experiencing a little bit of tension in my faith identity at the moment, is that there's, recently, I mean, I'm talking like in the last 2 or 3 years, because we live in such a kind of strange and volatile political and cultural moment. There seems to be this push in the reform community to kind of tailor to that moment where, Judaism as a practice or a tradition kind of flies out the window in favor of kind of addressing these more earthly political concerns. And I think that my temple does a fairly good sorry, does a fairly good job of balancing the kind of the relevance of the political moment with the philosophy or the spirituality of Judaism on questions of morality or just ethics in general, I guess. They do it all right, but I've also been to other temples where kind of it's lost its core identity of Judaism, and it just has kind of the outward trappings of being in a synagogue and engaging in a Sabbath service, but at the core of the sermon or the week's lesson, it seems like the Judaism has been put on the back burner, and that's not really what I want to engage in as a Jew. That's not really what I view my identity or my practice as. And so I've kind of been moving more in a conservative direction just to get some of that kind of that core identity or that core culture back in my own practice. It's kind of it's an interesting place to be right now in the 21st century.
That's interesting because on the last episode, when I was talking to Ben about in the LDS tradition, he
Mm-hmm.
said he noticed the same thing, and to a certain extent, I think it exists in the Catholic Church as well. Although for varying reasons, some parishes, like you said, some parishes handle it better than others. There is this kind of almost politicizing of the faith,
Mm-hmm.
which at worst, kind of at best, it puts people in two camps on the internet, on Twitter, but at worst, it can interfere with, we'd say, the liturgy, but like the service.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you think? Do you find also that there are so the Sabbath is very much a from my limited study of Judaism, the Sabbath seems very much like a reading of the Torah, reading of the scriptures of the day. For us, that's that's the first part of the Mass. Do you find that kind of in the celebration or in the festival, there are arguments about how it should be celebrated, as far like not just the
That there are what? Sorry, you cut out again.
yeah, well, like in the Catholic faith, there are what we'd say liturgy wars, people who want to return to an earlier form of celebrating the service. people who want like, and their concerns, like even things as small as, and I don't want to say small because there are reasons for it, but which way the priest faces.
Hmm.
Um, whether certain prayers should be omitted or certain prayers should be said, even if they're not in the text of the liturgy.
Hmm.
Um, do you find that exists in for in synagogue communities, or
Uh,
go ahead.
well, no, I mean, certainly not in my practice. There really seems to be no qualms about, how the prayers are, or rather how the service is led and conducted. I have seen different prayers come and go, and they all have very nice sentiments, and I don't mind any of them being there, and I don't mind any of the older ones being gone. There's usually a kind of a, well, okay, here's what you have to, the Sabbath service is divided into kind of three main parts, right? You have what's called Kabbalat Shabbat, which is kind of welcoming in the spirit of Shabbat, or the metaphorically, it's like a welcoming a bride into a wedding. That's kind of the, like, literally, that is in the text. But it's really about getting everyone kind of relaxed and joyful to be here, to be able to rest at the end of the week and to unite with God, if that's, kind of the mindset that you're bringing into the service. And then you have tefillah, which is kind of this standard set of prayers that doesn't ever really change, and it's all about honoring God, giving thanksgiving, honoring the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and then finally you get to an explication of the Torah portion of the week, which doesn't actually get read until Saturday morning, but on Friday evenings, which is the one I go to. You get a sermon on the reading before the reading actually happens. It's kind of an interesting thing that happens that way. But most of the change in the order of prayers I've seen has been in Kabbalat Shabbat, which is, to me, not really the most important part of the service. So I have no qualms with people who choose to do that.
That's interesting. So there are Friday night services,
Hmm.
but at those Friday night services, the reading is not read
That's
be-
right. Yeah.
because it has to be read on Saturday, or is
Oh
there?
man, I don't know if it has to be read on Saturday. That's kind of what I've known in my own practice, and that seems to be the case because, so for example, when a Jewish child becomes a bar mitzvah, when they have their bar mitzvah, they read from the Torah, and a bar mitzvah service is always on Saturday morning.
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's some law embedded deep within the Talmud that says the Torah has to be read on Saturday morning, but certainly that's just always how it's been in my experience.
And you use that word a couple times, Talmud.
Right.
I think people have a general understanding that it's kind of like the laws governing Judaism.
Uh-huh.
Is there perhaps, could you give me maybe a brief kind of explanation on what the Talmud is?
It's well, it's to say it's law is not quite accurate because, well, it is. It's kind of a second order law. So you have the Mosaic laws, which were given to the Israelites in Egypt, which is recounted in the various books of the Torah. But the Talmud is jurisprudence on those laws.
Okay.
So it's the writings of old Jewish scholars who said, "Look, we found this ambiguity in the Torah, or we found this contradiction in some of the laws. How are we going to rectify that?" And so they look to other places in the Torah and say, "Look, in the Torah it says, X, Y, and Z, and therefore, this, point A in the contradiction should take precedence, and therefore, it's jurisprudence. It's just kind of reconciling the finer points of Mosaic law.
Okay. So
Yeah.
it's not scripture itself,
No.
but it, kind of a development from it, kind of a commentary that's kind of been accepted into the tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is more important for conservative and Orthodox Jews than it is for Reform. I mean, I have never, as a Reform Jew, kind of actively studied the Talmud. Most of my exposure to the Talmud has been through more conservative rabbis.
And is the Talmud read during services, or is it only scripture that's read?
Generally, it's only scripture that's read during services. Talmud is kind of it's a separate area of study that you usually engage in during the week, because the week is for your kind of your worldly concerns and worrying about the practical things in life, which is reflected in the Talmud, because Talmud is kind of man's interpretation of God's law. So when you're studying Talmud during the week, that's when you're concerned with man, I guess. And then during the Sabbath, when you're supposed to rest and divorce yourself from the world or all your earthly worries, then you study God's word directly, which is in the scripture.
Yeah, and that actually brings up an interesting point, because just like how a lot of people think Christianity is just something you do for an hour on Sunday, but that's not right. It's something that's lived every day, every hour of the day.
Right.
That would be true about Judaism too. So, a
It's
lot
certain. Yes.
oh, go ahead.
All right. No, it certainly is. I wouldn't. Okay, actually, you know what? You talk first, because I just realized I could go down a big old rabbit hole of different topics here. But why don't you finish your thought?
Well, I was just going to ask. I could imagine some people might think, like, well, being Jewish is all about the Sabbath, and while the Sabbath is important, there are kind of weekly duties.
Yeah.
So, what are some things, like, throughout the week, other than attending Sabbath, that you might do as a Jew?
Okay, so the weekly, I mean, weekly duties. It's more of a daily duty thing, because very traditional Judaism is a very ritualistic faith. There's the Torah and some other scriptures lay out, very specific orders of things that you do during the day. So there are rituals for when you eat. There are rituals for when you bathe, when you go to bed at night, and when you wake up in the morning. And collectively, these are referred to as mitzvot. And literally in Hebrew, mitzvot means commandments, but kind of in modern Jewish practice, a lot of people have equated the word mitzvot to mean good deeds. So there are good deeds that you do which involve dietary laws and morning rituals and evening rituals. But then there's also things, for example, a mitzvah that has always stuck with me, even as a Reform Jew, is something called tikkun olam, which means to take care of the world. It's to be a steward of the earth, because the earth and where we live is a sacred place. And so, that's something that's always stuck with me. There are mitzvot like taking care of yourself. There are mitzvot of tzedakah, which is charity. There are mitzvot of what's a good one? Yeah, I can't think of one at the moment. But there are these daily acts of goodness, or these daily acts of, or the daily fulfillment of the commandments. And that, to me, is really kind of the core of Judaism, and the Sabbath and all the festivals are just another component of it.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me that you use the same word mitzvot, good deeds, to refer to kind of liturgical or ritualistic, um, you know, laws or rules
Hmm.
or practices, as well as ethical practices.
That's right. There's a I can't remember who said it. It might have been just kind of like an aphorism or like a general sentiment, kind of summarizing Jewish thought on this issue. But I have heard it said that in most societies, the people make the laws, and in Judaism, the laws make the people. It's very much about fulfilling those laws and acting out the things that God meant for us to do as His chosen people. That's kind of the core ethos of Judaism.
Yeah, I wanted to say, I know we have a smaller audience today. Maybe it's because we did it on a Wednesday as opposed to Tuesday. But for anyone watching, if you have any questions to ask, just put it in the chat and I'll read it out.
Clement Downs says, "What is the point of these acts if you're an atheist?"
Yeah, and I think that you know, do you find attentions like why these mitzvot, if they weren't commanded by God?
Right. So well, this really comes down to a matter of practice and denomination, because there are numbered in the Torah 613 mitzvot. That's a lot of them. Okay.
Mhm.
Orthodox Jews generally try to fulfill all 613 mitzvot in their daily lives at some point or another. It's not like a goal that has to be met, but if it's in the Torah, if it's one of those 613, then you follow it. Reform Judaism doesn't really have that emphasis. There are, we focus a lot on the ethical mitzvot, but not necessarily on those other ones like the dietary laws or the morning and evening rituals. Those are, to us, not as important because, well, I don't really know why. But to me, when I am doing an ethical mitzvah is the singular of mitzvot. When I'm doing an ethical mitzvah, it is often not because I was informed of it by my Judaism, but rather that my Judaism kind of reinforces my own moral intuitions. And so, when I am doing something like tikkun olam, taking care of the world, or taking care of myself, um, or giving charity, there's something distinctly Jewish. And again, this is, a matter of me living out my tradition, or me embracing and celebrating my tradition. There is something distinctly Jewish in kind of the mindset I bring to approaching those acts. So there is, I guess, in a sense, it is kind of informed by my Judaism, but it's, a lot of it is not contingent necessarily on God, or because God necessarily commanded it. It's more about that we as a Jewish culture, or as a Jewish community or society, or whatever you want to call us, have really embraced and internalized these values and practices. And so when I do them, uh, it is also an act of me honoring my community and bringing kind of Jewish value into that.
So it's not that, I mean, it's not that you do these things because you're Jewish, but because you're
Yeah.
Jewish, you doing them has a greater meaning.
Has a what? Sorry.
Has a greater meaning, or
Yeah,
you know,
certainly. Yes, there's a lot of extra weight added to those kinds of acts, at least in my mind.
yeah, no, I think that's interesting. Some something else I wanted to touch on is
Hmm.
uh a lot of Jews, both religious and secular Jews, reform conservative, will feel a connection to Israel, and there are others that don't. Do you personally feel a connection to Israel? And what form does that connection take?
So sorry, repeat the last part of that question.
Yeah, do you feel a connection to Israel, and like what form does that connection take?
Do I have a personal connection to Israel? Only insofar as it is kind of the ancestral home of my people. That is the most. I mean, the region of Israel and the history it contains, the monuments and the relics, and all of that it contains. Yes, I do have a. I wouldn't call it a spiritual connection, but certainly it holds a certain sway over me. It has a certain fascination, I guess. I do believe that the state of Israel is legitimate. I think it is completely legitimate for the Jews to have a homeland. That is not to say that I don't have some reservations about being on board with Benjamin Netanyahu or the Mossad or, kind of the governing bodies of the state at the moment. But as kind of a spiritual homeland, yes, I would say I have a connection to Israel. It's not a big part of my religious life, though. So that's the caveat. It's a part, but it's not a big part.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can totally understand that. I love my country. I don't love what my country's doing kind of feeling. And that can be applied to, the spiritual home of my people as well. I noticed Professor Farnsworth in the chat said, that's kind of weird. I guess that's in reference to being a Jewish atheist. Do you find that, perhaps not in the Reform community, but do you find, do you get asked to kind of address being a Jewish atheist either from the atheist community or from the Jewish community?
No, not especially. I don't know. It's not really. I guess it's not really something that ever gets brought up because as far as there is an atheist community, well, I will say that most of my peers are also atheists. They have never kind of called my quote unquote atheism into question. Because of my Jewish identity, a lot of my Jewish friends are also atheists. So, again, it's especially in the Reform community. I don't think it's not really a big deal. It's not something that ever gets brought up. No one's saying, you absolutely must believe in God, or we will, what's the word I'm looking for, or we will excommunicate you. No, I don't think either of those have ever been in tension within my own communities. If anything, they're more at tension within myself. But we've covered that a little bit.
Do you find do you find atheists kind of questioning religious practices? I know I'm doing it right now as a Catholic, but do you get that question a lot? Like, why do you celebrate the festivals? Why do you do the prayers? Why do you pray the prayers if you don't believe in God?
Right. Yeah. No. No one ever asks me that. I've asked myself a few times, but it's never. I think I think that would have been a more relevant question maybe 10 years ago when the new atheist movement was taking off, and there was what I would describe as a lot of radical atheism, where any hint of something religious is anathema to a new atheist, because which I kind of understand, because I feel like the movement was kind of getting its footing as a serious public intellectual force, and so they kind of had to carve out an identity for themselves. But I think that line of thinking, or that way of thinking, has kind of removed itself from cultural relevance at this point. So it's right, at this point in my life, when I'm, you know, publicly avowed as both a Jew and an atheist, I don't really think that's particularly relevant at this point in time.
Yeah, that is an interesting point you brought up. Like there were definitely, with the four horsemen,
Mhm.
Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Harris, there was kind of an energy that, and you can see an attempt at that with the, so-called Dark Enlightenment, or the what is it, the intellectual dark
Fictional
web.
dark web, yeah.
Yeah, you kind of see an attempt to kind of recreate that, but it's definitely not the same energy that they had in the early aughts. Um,
Well,
some,
there's sorry, go continue.
I was just gonna say, I always attributed that, to kind of two factors: 9/11, what happened in 2001, and the abuse crisis in the Catholic Church, which,
Right.
that was really hit home in 2002, and
Hmm.
unfortunately, we've been kind of reminded about it this week.
Right.
Do you think did did you particularly notice kind of a struggle in the Jewish community during the early aughts?
I don't
Um,
think. Sorry. Well, I don't think I was particularly aware of that movement during the early aughts. I mean, I was in 2007. I was what 10 years old. It wasn't really on my radar, but
you speak so much more authoritatively than, you know your voice makes you seem much older than you are.
I appreciate that. Actually, I take that as a compliment. Um, no, I don't think I was. That wasn't really on my radar, and I was going to say something else. Um, Damn,
Well,
now I forget. Well,
sorry.
anyway, no, that certainly wasn't on my radar at the time. So I don't know. I think we've. I will say I think we've felt. I think some of the echoes of that movement into the present, though. Not necessarily from the intellectual dark web, but I mean even in a reform Jewish community, where earlier I described this problem of kind of being stripped of that core Jewish identity and catering more to modern politics. I think that a lot of that new atheist sentiment was about kind of having material explanations for everything, and trying to um, establish a system of ethics purely along a material line. And I see that reflected in a lot of reform communities now. Personally, I am on board with that project of having kind of a materialist view of ethics. We had a whole conversation about it a few weeks ago, but that's just a personal observation of mine, is that even in faith communities, that sort of materialist view, I think, has crept in a lot. And I think it does speak to the cultural force of that new atheism movement, even if it has kind of shrunk away from the public eye in more recent years.
Yeah, I mean, there's very much a sense that, even though they kind of lasted for a brief moment, they did capture a generation, in a way that even if you're seeing more millennials turning towards religion, and and you see statistics showing this, or even if they're not turning to belief in God, kind of traditional religious practices.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look at YouTube, pretty much all the big social media sites, like kind of all the big players on there, are either secular, atheist, or if they are religious, they really don't talk about it much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, do you think they're? Oh, go ahead.
So no, go. You ask your question.
I was gonna say, do you think do you think there is a place for, there's a need for religious people to kind of insofar as religion represents kind of a tradition in Western thought, or um a something worthwhile to our heritage.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a need for kind of religious people online to kind of evangelize to social media?
Yeah, I wouldn't say evangelize. That's not that's not really my view of a my faith, at least. Well, Judaism is not an evangelizing, it's not a proselytizing religion, so I'm kind of naturally averse to that kind of thinking. But I do think, and this is a development I've noticed in myself fairly recently, is that I've noticed kind of a I think that the religious have been gaining a kind of a greater share of the market on, I mean, on YouTube especially. I think that people like Jordan Peterson have really kind of been able to bring religion and especially Christianity back into the mainstream cultural conversation. And what I've noticed within myself is that I've been giving a lot more credence to religion and the religious than I had as a teenager, because as a teenager I was pretty radically on board with this Dawkins project of atheism is the only way, and anyone who is explicitly religious or theistic is just stupid. And I've definitely moved away from that in more recent years, and I do think that there is a faction, especially on the far left at the very least, but maybe also in the mainstream left, that still have that kind of chauvinistic attitude, and I would like to see that expunged from our public discourse. And I think that religion as a school of thought, broadly speaking, I think it should be given a little more credence in the public eye. I just think it had some very bad actors that were made highly public in the early aughts, as you said, 9/11 and the priest abuse scandal. I think that certainly didn't help the religious viewpoint. But no, I if not to evangelize, then certainly I think that I would like to have a public discourse with as many voices as possible, and that would include the religious. So that's my 2 cents on that issue.
Yeah. Well, we're getting pretty close to the top of the hour. So I actually had one last question, which is, if someone watching this video what became interested in atheism, Judaism, or kind of the intersection of the two, would there be a book you recommend or a resource you recommend that either you go to, or something that you found helpful along your way?
I think a good place to go, well, if you're interested in Judaism, and okay, if you're interested in Judaism generally, go talk to a rabbi or a number of rabbis. I'm sure, you know, they would, if you email them or go walk into their temple, I'm sure they would be happy to answer your questions about the faith. Wikipedia is not a bad resource if you want to understand the faith from, say, an academic perspective. I'm not going to bash Wikipedia. I use it a lot. If you're interested in the intersection between Judaism and atheism, I would say specifically go speak to Reform rabbis or Reform scholars. I don't know if there are any major Reform texts that I could recommend, but kind of understanding the Reform community might be a good point of access for an atheist who's interested in the Jewish culture or the Jewish tradition or being Jewish. So I think that's what I can say about that.
Cool. Well, anyone else in the chat have a quick question before we close out? If not, well, Reality Weasel, thanks for coming on. You know, really enjoyed this.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Was there anything else you kind of wanted to say, or if not,
you know what? Yes, I will say something in closing. I mentioned earlier that I've moved away from the new atheist line of thinking. Part of that was the chauvinism that I saw coming from the adherents of the Four Horsemen, as it were. But another part of that was that I couldn't. There were questions I had about philosophy and metaphysics and morality that the new atheists seemed to be kind of lacking on. And so I used to treat their word as gospel, and obviously I don't anymore. I think they were lacking in some areas. And so that's been, I think, the greatest tension between my Judaism and my atheism, where I think that things like truth and goodness and beauty do exist, and that I think is part of my religious side or my religious upbringing. But trying to explain that, using materialist or secular means, which, those are kind of the tools I'm working with at the moment. That's been my main philosophical enterprise, I guess. That's where a lot of the tension comes in, because it's a difficult dialogue to have within yourself. And so for all the people who find my being a Jew and an atheist strange, in some sense, yes, it is strange, and that's why. That's the dialogue I'm having with myself.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for answering all these questions. I found it very enlightening, and I'm sure the audience and people who view this video will. Thanks to the audience for watching, and to everyone, go with God.
All right.